Okay. I can't help it when people are frightened, says Mary Cat. I always want to frighten them more. From Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 19 in season 3. And today we are continuing our discussion of creepy children. Okay, so listeners, you will know if you were able to listen to last week's or the week before last's main episode that we started a new series on creepy children, and this is our second episode on said creepy children. So if you haven't listened to the first episode yet, in that one we talked a little bit about, like we usually do, why we find children to be creepy, just when they're just being normal children, but also when they're happen to be in a ghost story or a horror movie or book. And we talked a little bit about different types of creepy children. So we talked a little bit about sociopath children, so children that are uncanny and that they're not innocent and vulnerable. They're actually killers. They're born with some sort of mental illness or psychological reason for why they act the way they do. So we talked about the bad seed. You could also put Thomas Tryon's the Other in that category. And then we talked a little bit about kids are creepy because they're supernatural. So, The Omen. I think we talked a little bit about, we gestured at Rosemary's Baby, which we've talked about in a past episode on the podcast. And so we talked a little bit about the differences between the types of creepy children. So this time around, we are continuing our discussion of creepy children with maybe more, a little bit more contemporary, perhaps, examples. But we felt like we needed to start with one of the kind of ultimate creepy children, who is Mary Cat. Mary Cat Blackwood from Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle, who is a fascinating character and comes from a writer who is no stranger to writing about creepy children. She wrote 2 kind of memoir or domestic sketches about her own children, Raising Demons and Life Among the Savages, which you can tell just from the titles. Basically didn't have to do too much except describe the children to show their kind of creepy things that they may say or do. And I mean, I feel like as a reader of We Have Always Lived in the Castle, that she kind of gets that type of disturbing character. And she also has the ambiguity that she has in a lot of her works as well. Personally, of Shirley Jackson's works, The Haunting of Hill House always tops out for me because that was the first Shirley Jackson I read other than The Lottery. But We Have Always Lived in the Castle comes very close after that. Lisa, I know you're a big fan of We Have Always Lived in the Castle. Do you want to start us off with our discussion about Mary Cat?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I'll say I'm so glad that you mentioned her Shirley Jackson's 2 domestic sketchbooks, if that's what you want to call them. I love them. I've read both of them. Raising Demons is one that I kind of keep next to me because they're just so funny. Just the little odd stories she tells. And I think it's the one in Raising Demons where, they are, and I will say, yes, they are creepy. The children at times are creepy. And I think anyone who has ever been a caretaker of a small child knows that that's true. But I mean, they're also just little funny stories. And I think there was one in Raising Demons where she talks about how she had been up, of course, because she's Shirley Jackson. She had been up like all night doing fabulous Shirley Jackson things, drinking with writers who would come through their house and staying up late and playing with her crystal ball and doing all her, kind of occult magic tricks for her friends and just being a general joy, I think. But that does not work well when you are a mother all the time, because children like to get up early and they like, they're very demanding when they wake up in the morning. At least that's been my experience. And anyway, I think there was a sketch in Raising Demons where she talks about how she had basically overslept, and she wakes up to find the kitchen in chaos and like half the children gone. I think I'm telling the story right. And one of them came back saying that they had eaten at the neighbors, and apparently they had just gone over there and been like, Mom doesn't feed us. And they had gotten pancakes and syrup over there. And so she was just kind of talking, like, I'm just imagining her standing there with like a coffee in one hand and a cigarette in the other, and wondering why these children smell like maple syrup and have been over at the neighbors saying she doesn't feed them. And she tells it this, I'm butchering the story. She tells it in so much more wonderful detail, and it's hilarious. But one thing that I think is really interesting is when you look at something like that, to me, the Shirley Jackson home must have been a wonderful home to grow up in, because I think it just must have been surrounded with so much life and imagination. And that is kind of the same thing that we get in the Blackwood home, which this is trying to my transition into We Have Always Lived in the Castle. But of course, it takes on a much more sinister turn there, because it's not the kids running off and kind of telling stories about their mom to the neighbors and making them worry, but rather it's most of the Blackwood family that has been murdered by arsenic-laced sugar. But one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I think will kind of be a good theme to explore in this episode, is how it's not always just children that are born creepy, right? Or children that are born murderous, or children that are born monsters, but more of children that are born into a very specific environment and how children are shaped by that environment. Because I think when we look at why we find children so creepy, beyond just like the uncanniness of it all, and looking at them as being this kind of small human, everything we talked about in the last episode, where, it's so hard to teach them things like empathy, and to have true feelings for another person, and to really care and love another person. That's something that's very difficult, I think, to teach. But when you look at something like We Have Always Lived in the Castle, you see what happens when a childhood kind of gets distorted by, in this case, extreme isolation. And I think that speaks to one of our real deep fears of these creepy children, because it's not just, well, they were born monsters, but what if we made them into monsters? And I think that may be a running theme through a lot of the stories and novels and movies that we talk about in this episode, is how we kind of are responsible for creating these tiny little monsters. I don't know. Maybe I'm overreaching there, but what do you think about We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and that kind of theme of isolation and the imaginative world that it kind of created, that I think is both problematic and a help to the children?
I feel like in some ways, well, I agree with you, but I was thinking while you were talking, in some ways that is part of the ambiguity that we love so much about Shirley Jackson, right? Because we basically know by the end of the book who did the poisoning. And there are times when, when Mary Catherine just goes to the grocery store and she's picturing, everybody dead and bleeding and these really kind of violent imaginings. And I think there's the possibility that she might be kind of a bad seed character, but I also agree with you that something happened maybe when she was a child that exacerbated that, or that maybe that environment nurtured her to be that way, because the Blackwoods were not nice people. I mean, they took other people's land. They had more money than everybody else, so they basically dictated terms. They consolidated their power over the community, and they fenced themselves in, and they raised Mary Cat and her sister to be very isolated and very distrustful of outsiders. And there's implications in the text that Mary Cat was treated pretty shoddily by her parents, punishing her with withholding food and locking her up, which is like isolation within isolation. And so I definitely think that regardless of how Mary Cat was born, the way that her parents acted, the way that her parents were cold and unempathetic themselves, it seems, um, maybe pushed her in certain directions that she wouldn't necessarily have gone in. Because even though Constance seems kind of like sweetness and light, there's a slight edge or darkness to her too. And I feel like the way that they were raised might have something to do with that. But we don't get, I don't know, it's been a little while since I read the book from beginning to end, but I don't think we ever get a true picture of exactly how they were treated. But I do feel like there's enough evidence to show that the way they were raised has a lot of implications for how they act.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up specifically that grocery store scene, and it happens fairly early in the novel. So for those of you who have not read it, it's not spoiling too much. I would almost suggest jumping to that chapter because it's maybe one of my favorite scenes that Shirley Jackson has ever written because it is so aggressive in its violence. And to come from the point of view of, and I think by this point, Mary Cat is a young adult. We could call her. I mean, what is she? 18 years old in the book?
Maybe a little younger.
Yeah,
but
around
not
there.
much. Yeah.
So yeah, she's mid to late teens. I think we could put her in that category. So she's not exactly a child anymore, but that scene is dripping with such hatred, and the townspeople are not nice to her. I mean, there's a lot of snarky comments, and I mean, just downright rudeness. But the scene that she paints in her head of just utter slaughter is, to me that kind of hatred is learned over years and years of experience. And I agree with you that we don't exactly know everything that went on in her childhood. But to me, it's almost just the idea of they have been so isolated. They have been in this, they've always lived in the castle. They've lived in this manor house away from everybody else. And there's been distrust between the outsiders and the people who are in the family, but also a lot of distrust in the family, which you get with kind of cousin Charles, who comes later. There's a lot of anger towards him, a lot of, again, that kind of in your face aggressive violence, feelings towards him. But yeah, I mean, she could have been a bad seed, but I really think that that's a good example of what kind of isolation and warped thinking will do when a child is brought up only in that and has no exposure to the outside world. I mean, in a lot of ways, Shirley Jackson's the stories like this, you get this, you get like the Sundial, maybe even a little bit of The Haunting of Hill House, in the way Eleanor is so isolated from everybody. But it's almost like this cult mentality. We just did that episode arc on cults. And when you're in such an insular group, whether it's a cult or it's a family that isolates itself, you do get that warped sense of the world. And a lot of times it comes with mistrust, and that can often grow into hatred for people who are not like you. And I think Mary Cat she fits into that. I mean, she's wonderful. Yeah, I love her when she gets into her descriptions of the world that she imagines, having picnics on the moon and all this wonderful things. That is a wonderful, like her world that she imagines can be really wonderful, but it can also be really terrifying to those that she sees as a threat.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, Shirley Jackson does do this idea of like isolation via class very well. Her books often have people who think they're better than everybody else around them and wall themselves off in some sort of huge estate. I mean, the characters in Road Through the Wall all want that, and the Hill House is that, the Blackwood Manor is that. Fancy and the Sundial is a really good example of a creepy kid. I mean, she may be a murderer, and she uses her dollhouse to plot out her, her nefarious things.
I am
That's such a great book.
I am so ready. I mean, I'm very, very glad that we are talking about The Haunting of Hill House, and that We Have Always Lived in the Castle has become such a public topic of fascination. That I love that. But I am ready for somebody to really bring back the Sundial, because it really is. It is a great book.
Maybe we should do an episode on the Sundial at some point.
I think so.
Yeah, I love when she's playing with her dollhouse. I mean, it is the ultimate creepy child move to, like, use power where you need it. And again, going back to the Blackwoods, Fancy has this moment when she says, people are dying in the book, which means that she's kind of rising and being able to inherit. And she basically says, like, I'll be happy when so-and-so kicks the bucket, because then I can throw my dollhouse away because I'll have the real thing. And there's this idea of practicing to be that person of means in the manor house who's going to closet yourself away from everybody, isolate yourself. And yeah, you're right. I mean, when you're raised in situations of that, like raised to, in some ways, hate other people, or that's what you see around you, or you think you're better than them, it almost doesn't matter how Fancy and Merricat were born. Though I think, Merricat in particular shows wonderful moments of imagination. It always kind of turns to this give and take she has with the villagers. And the villagers are mean and evil. I mean, we don't know how the villagers were, though, before this. But yeah, that idea of isolation, I totally agree with you. And I don't know, this may be getting off the subject a little bit, so I don't want to go too far down the road. But when you were talking about setting yourself off from people and hating them, I was thinking of, isn't it in Helen Oyeyemi's The Whitest for Witching, where the house kind of takes in the isolation and superiority complexes of the people who own it? Isn't that what happens in that book, or am I misremembering?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, well, I mean, yeah, it that's a hard book to talk about.
Yeah, and I'm not saying we should talk about it now, but that's what I was thinking about.
I love Whitest for Witching, but yeah, the house kind of is. It both is its own personality, but it also feeds upon the personalities of people around it. And of course, the characters themselves that when you enter the two sisters who come into the house, they've each got their own dealings with grief and mental illness. And yeah, that all kind of feeds into it. When this is why I say this is why it's a hard book to talk about, because as I'm talking about it, I keep thinking of like Hill House, right? Mm-hmm. But Whitest for Witching is about, to me, as far away as you can get from The Haunting of Hill House and still have like a sentient haunted house. It just has a very different tone and theme and feel to it, which I know it is very vague in describing it, but I don't know if I can do better.
It's more like, I guess, I mean, Hill House is kind of sentient and deals with those things too, but Whitest for Witching strikes me as it's a sentient racist haunted house. I guess, if you want to put it that way, or against others, people who don't fit into the family.
Yeah, hostile maybe.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
That's a difficult one to talk about intelligently, because I don't know. Every time I want to talk about that book in any real sort of way, it kind of my own vocabulary maybe doesn't falls short of what I'm trying to say. That's a really good book, though. I'm glad you mentioned it.
Creepy kids, too.
Yes. Yeah. Again. But kind of going back to the Sundial, I also want to point out the dollhouse again, that it is a miniature version of the Halloran house. And any time in horror that you get a house within a house, I mean, that should be a red flag right there that this is not going well. Because
indeed, yeah.
The hubris alone of having somebody model a dollhouse to look exactly like the home that you live in and then gift it to a child. And maybe that's part of the problem. You're getting to the idea, Mel, of how in something like We Have Always Lived in the Castle, it's not just the outsiders who are hostile um, to the Blackwood family. I mean, the Blackwood family, they are horrible people, and they're fighting over their money, and they're fighting over who it belongs to, and they think they're better than everybody in the town. I mean, there's a reason they set themselves off. And the Halloran family is pretty much exactly the same. That kind of mentality of um yeah, that kind of hubris that just goes along with a family like that. It lends itself well to hauntings and creepy children and
Yeah, it really does. It really plays with what we think family should be, and it plays in very real fears because there are families that are torn by these sorts of things. This may be extreme in the fiction, but it definitely plays off of our fears of what could happen, um, in really kind of extreme but really interesting ways. And I agree completely with you that anytime a dollhouse appears in almost anything, it's usually going to be creepy, at least to me. um, that does signal a hubris, and I'm going to make this thing in miniature. And this, I guess this shows how strange my research is sometimes, but I was reading articles about dollhouses in literature last year, actually, and there was just a list of all the different books, some for children or young adults, but also others where dollhouses are miniatures of houses, and they become like places where hauntings are replayed or people get sucked into them and punished. They are like everything that can happen in a haunted house, or all the things that can happen to a family in a house get replayed in these dollhouses and kind of miniaturized in really interesting ways.
I'm almost positive I have mentioned this before, but if I haven't, I need to. And that was a book that I loved growing up, which was called The Dollhouse Murders,
Mm-hmm.
by author Betty Wren Wright. And I want to say this book came out in like the mid 80s, maybe early 80s. I don't remember exactly when, but I had it. It was an old ratty paperback. I don't know where I got it from, but it was basically the story was that a girl went to go live at her aunt's house. I can't remember why now, but the aunt, it was like that. She lived in the family home. They had a doll house that looked exactly like the house they were living in. And every night the doll house would recreate this like grisly murder that had happened in the house. And the aunt, of course, thought the little girl was doing it, and she was like, "No, I'm not." And yeah, she may have been older. I'm calling her a little girl. She was probably like a preteen or maybe early teens. I feel like there was some angsty stuff going on in the book too. It's been a while since I read it. But, it basically became like I have to solve this murder now. It's basically like a starter horror book for kids. But I loved it. But there is just something to that of the idea. I mean, when you think about the way children play with dolls too, not even if this was like a haunted dollhouse, but not all of them are. I mean, the one in the Sundial wasn't necessarily, it was just
Mm-hmm.
more how the girl played with it and how she manipulated the dolls. And that's something that is really fascinating, because when you see a child play with something like that, a lot of their personality will come through. Um, and that can be kind of creepy and eye-opening and not necessarily a good way.
Yeah, I mean it's a measure of control, right? Um, I was thinking, there's that Twilight Zone episode. I cannot remember the title of it, but the one where the people are in like the kids' play place, like the town, and everything is being constantly kind of moved around on them. And so this idea that we could be like toys in the hands of a an angry child, or just, like you said, if you just watch the way children normally play with toys, making them do whatever they want, or you have to be over here now. I mean, it's kind of terrifying to think of the types of control that can be practiced or exercised. Like, practice if it's not a supernatural dollhouse, but if it is a supernatural one, then maybe, use the doll to affect people in real life. Yeah, it is kind of disturbing. I guess watching children play with anything could be kind of disturbing, though, because you're right. I mean, their personality is going to come out in the way they treat the toy or whatever it is that they're doing, or whatever story or imaginative aspect they're taking or they're playing at that point.
I don't want to get too far. I mean, I love Shirley Jackson, and I don't want to run off from her if we're not done. But that does remind me when you talk about just children's play and how creepy it can be. And I don't want to talk in depth about this movie because it is still relatively new and I don't want to spoil anything. But the movie Hereditary has a wonderful young actress in it, and she in the movie, this is not spoiling anything, but her mom makes miniatures. She's an artist, and so she basically does doll houses, but shows them as art. And her daughter has kind of followed in her footsteps, except she really likes taxidermy. And again, right there, it's just kind of, it brings up this idea of, okay, children really should not be playing with dead things. That seems, that gets you in a really visceral kind of way. But also really good because, and this is really interesting because this isn't a bad child, but it is a creepy child. And that's Danny in The Shining.
Mm-hmm.
And the way he has his little imaginary friends, because all of that is very much imaginative child's play. I mean, he's got The Shining, hence the name of the movie or in the book. So his imaginative child's play is more than just that, but it is still really creepy nonetheless to watch him in the movie, like crook his little finger and his voice lower and start talking.
Well, it's also kind of implied, and I read the book, but it's been 25 years or so, so I'm going to stick more to the movie, which I've seen more recently. But it is kind of implied that Danny in The Shining is not just, that's not just kids play. That's maybe some sort of psychic thing, or speaking to some sort of ghost or something, right? I'm not making that up, am I?
No, I mean, in fact, that's what they call The Shining, is that like it's really weird because it is kind of nebulous what he can do, but that he is talking with people.
And he can see things.
He has some sort of psychic ability that is undefined, but that's what, in fact, pulling this full circle, thank you very much, isn't that when he's able to communicate with the character who's actually named Halloran, right? Did I make that up? I should have reread this book.
I'm not sure.
Oh, wait, yeah, to call for help?
Yes.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's been a couple years since I last read the book, but yeah, because he sends out, that's how he knows to come try to help him.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, that was his last name, wasn't it? Like,
you're right.
Something yeah. Halloran. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He was like, not the caretaker, but yeah, he was the guy that tells him the phrase "The Shining" and all of that. Yeah.
Yes, because he's the one in the movie, and I'm not going to get into why, like, whether the book is better or the movie is better, because that's that would take us down a long rabbit hole right now. But at least in the movie, he's the one who's taking them around when they're getting settled, and he realizes that young Danny has
the shine.
The shine, yeah, that he's like basically the shining child, that he can do these things. But that had to have been King's. I've never looked into this, but I'm just guessing that has to be King referencing Jackson's The Sundial. Maybe.
Yeah, that's a possibility, because The Sundial was his primary influence for The Shining, with a little bit of Haunting of Hill House. Yeah.
Yeah. Man, I mean, Danny, I feel like he fits right on top of this list of creepy children. And I like that he isn't, like we said, he is not the bad seed. He's not the murderer. He's the one who, I mean, really is the glue, even more so in the book, that's keeping things together.
And he's vulnerable still. Like, you feel sorry
Right.
for him that he's getting this information he doesn't understand and that he has to deal with that.
He is fully a child.
Mhm.
You know, he's not taking on adult responsibilities. But you also see too that kind of the anxieties of parenthood play out with Danny, because again, more so in the book, I think you see how his father and his mother are really worried about how certain things that have happened to him are going to affect him in the future. And so there is a lot of this anxiety of who are we creating here? You know, what type of person are we creating, and are we raising him the way we want to raise him,
Mhm.
and teaching him the things we want to teach him?
And the moments of abuse, that happen as well.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I feel like that's played up more in the book. The moments of abuse that have happened and the guilt that his father feels over it.
It's more in the book, yeah.
Right.
And then the creepy twins are just in the movie.
True.
The creepy twin girls, yeah.
Which
they're so creepy.
Yeah.
I mean, that you have to, they really serve no function other than to be creepy, right? I guess they're just because gosh, this is where I have read the book more recently than I've watched the movie, and so I know they're standing there in dresses, they're holding hands, they're speaking in unison, which of course that's like the dollhouse miniature. You know, nothing good is going to happen. But who were they? Were they meant to be? They were the victims of the first guy who had kind of gone crazy and killed his family?
I think so. I think that's who they were meant to be.
And so they were supposed to be like a warning of this is going to happen.
But also because they kept saying, "Come play with us, Danny," and at one point, like, "Come play with us forever" or something. Like they had essentially. I always took it as like they, along with their dad, had been corrupted by the Overlook, because of their murder. Like, they became part of its whatever sinister plan to acquire more souls, kind of thing.
Right.
Which makes them ultimately creepy children, or yeah, like the pinnacle
Victims.
of creepy children.
But again, that kind of plays with our whole thesis here of you can take innocence and you put it with violence and abuse and isolation and a psychic house. And that turns them monstrous, right? So it does kind of fit with that anxieties of parenthood and what are you doing to your children, really?
Yeah. Also, usually when a child is a ghost, they're not nice. So,
unless you're Casper.
There you go. Yeah.
He maintained his innocence. Well, if we're in the realm of Stephen King already, I feel like we need to talk a little bit more about some of his creepy children, because, and I will go ahead and say, we're talking about Pet Sematary. I'm assuming much of what we talk about with this will probably be the 1989 film. I haven't gotten to see the newest one yet, so I can't really talk much about that as an adaptation. And Pet Sematary was one of those books that for some reason I just never picked up and read. And so I did so recently, but I'm only like halfway through it because Stephen King knows how to write really long books. So I don't know if you guys are with me on that, but when I talk about Pet Sematary, I am mainly talking about that 1989 film. And the little boy, Gage, is that his name? Am I remembering that? It's been a while since I've seen even this movie.
Yeah.
Gage is one of the most terrifying children And that kind of plays into what we were talking about with the Shining twins, of a child who becomes corrupt after death. You know, the idea that children that come back from the dead are not going to be okay. They're not going to be normal. They're going to be things of nightmares. And yeah, I don't know. What do you guys have to say about sweet little Gage?
Well, that whole I've read the book but it was, it's been a long time since I've read the book, but as I recall, it was fairly close. Like, the movie adaptation was fairly close, and again, I haven't seen the recent one either, so can't speak to that one yet, but I do want to see it. But yeah, just that idea of, like, the grief that happens when the kid is killed accidentally, and of course, I think most parents would probably at least consider what they did with him. But man, like, when he comes back, and he comes back so wrong, like, it's just, I don't even know how to put words to just how unsettling it is, because you, as the reader or the viewer of the movie, you know something's wrong, and something had gone wrong with the dog that had been buried and come back, but that wasn't enough to deter the dad from doing it. So it's like, it's a mistake, and then when he comes back, God, the kid is so creepy. Like, I don't even know where I'm going with that. I'm just sort of rambling about it, but yeah, creepy kid.
Yes.
I mean, he's basically comes back as this psychopathic murderer type thing, but that's almost like a demon wearing the skin of the kid. But it's so hard to put into words, though.
Yeah, I think you're right, though, when you were hitting upon this idea of grief and what the parents go through, because they had been warned not to do what they were going to do, basically. They had been warned about the pet cemetery, and I forget exactly how they phrased it, but just basically describing it as like the ultimate bad place. In the warnings, you don't go there, and there's all sorts of bad dreams and things that have been going on. And but I agree with you, like, and I almost feel like even if they had been through, or they knew what he might come back as, I completely understand why they went through with it. Why they buried his son out there despite all the warnings, and because that's one of those, the movie, at least, I've always thought it really handles foreshadowing well, in adding to, like, the kind of gloom and doom that's impending. Because as soon as the family, in the very beginning of the movie, as soon as they move into the house, they're warned about both the cemetery and the road that they're on. They worry about people going too fast on the road. And so right away, I mean, okay, yeah, what's going to happen, but their grief does feel so real and so true. And I've never been through that, and I hope I never have to go through that. But yeah, I feel like I would be at the point of desperation where it would be like, I don't care as long as I have him back. And that's what drives it. And I think that's what makes the story resonate with it, at least with me when I watch it. And yeah, I'm getting the same thing from the book as well, as I'm reading it. That same sort of, even despite all the warnings, even, there's kind of the old joke about why people say they don't like horror movies, and they say, well, it's because the people always hear something in the house and then run up the stairs instead of out the back door. And I kind of understand where people are coming from, because sometimes characters in horror movies don't always act rationally. And you think, no rational normal person would do that. But then when I watch something like this, or I read it and I think, okay, no, that is what somebody would do in the middle of that painful grief. That is what they would do. And I think that's one of the things that has made this story hold together for so long. That, and one of the scenes that just still haunts me today. And that is, I can't even say it. It's the Achilles tendon.
Oh yeah, yeah. I thought that's what you were talking.
Everybody knows, like, that is the worst. That is the worst. And for a child just to be standing there like with a glinting scalpel in his hand. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the ultimate creepy child in a way, because it's a killer and there's supernatural involved. Well, there's a ancient Indian burial ground involved. I'm doing air quotes.
It is.
Yeah, and he calls it a Micmac burial ground, but that's actually not the native people that live there. But that's for another episode, probably.
Yeah, listeners, we'll have to. I know Matt and Mel and I have had many a conversation about our kind of general distaste for ancient burial grounds, or like slavery being written off as the reason that something's turned bad. But we'll have to devote an entire episode to that, because that is another rabbit hole that will be too deep to jump down tonight. Since we're and I'm struggling to get words out right now as I'm sitting in front of this microphone, and just a little peek behind the scenes, listeners. It's pretty late at night, or at least late for me while we're recording this, because that was the only time that my house was quiet. And I am already dreading the walk up the stairs, and I'm going to have to pull the turn off the light and then jump into bed really quickly without letting my feet dingle over, because there might be a tiny little gauge with a scalpel waiting to get my heels. Yeah, I'm regretting talking about it now. But I do think it illustrates kind of the creepy children that we've been talking about. And I thought it would be kind of fun. I don't know if you guys are game for this, but I thought it would be kind of fun if we talk about some of our favorite, maybe newer creepy children in horror movies, because there are a lot out there to pick from. And so if it's okay, I'll start, and then Matt, Mel, hopefully you guys have some interesting recommendations, or at least some of the creepy children that have stuck with you in the way that, like Gage or the Shining twins, or any of the others we mentioned, have kind of become part of the horror fabric. But for me, and I don't want to say much about this movie, because it's going to be, I kept wanting to bring it up as we were talking tonight, and I kept shying away from it because it's going to be difficult to discuss without spoilers. But I think Jordan Peele's new movie, Us, does really fantastic things with creepy children and the imagery of that. Yeah, I'm afraid of saying anything else because I don't want that to be spoiled. So I think that's really well done. And then if we're talking about creepy children who are maybe closer to Danny in The Shining, where they're just kind of creepy, but not necessarily monstrous, where they're pretty innocent. I know we've talked about The Babadook a little bit, and I love that film. But the child in that movie, and he's there to kind of amplify the anxiety of what the mother is going through. But I mean, that child, he is just downright difficult at times. And I think he kind of plays into that creepy aspect of it. That's not really the center of the movie. Kind of in the same way the creepy children aren't the center of Us, but they're there, and they add to the atmosphere really well. So I'll go ahead and throw those out there as recommendations. I don't know, Matt, Mel, what do you guys have for
Well,
creepy children?
I would definitely agree with the Babadook. Also, just a great movie in
Oh, it
general.
is.
And we didn't really have a chance to talk about it in the episode, but we've talked about it in previous episodes, though. So, I mean, I will always throw a recommendation out for Paul Tremblay's Head Full of Ghosts, the book. Totally worth it. And I don't know how closely it fits into the creepy children the way we've been talking about them, but I think it definitely fits in there. And, I always like whenever we would make these references to creepy children as a horror topic in like our early episodes or even in this actual series now that we've gotten to do it, I always picture in my head that Doctor Who episode of the little British boy with the gas mask who I guess I don't even
Yes.
have to finish, but who's really well known for his catchphrase of "Are you my mommy?" and I cannot get that out of my head. I think that for me is the prototypical creepy kid. It just if you haven't seen that Doctor Who episode, it's from the rebooted Doctor Who. I believe it was. Oh, Mel, you might be able to help me with that. I know it might be the David Tennant time, or it might even have been that very first season with. I'm
I feel
drawing.
like it might have been the first season with Eccleston.
Yeah, I think it might have been with Christopher Eccleston. Um, but anyway, it's worth watching. So, um, anyway, that's it for me, I suppose. And thank you for not spoiling Us. I have not seen it yet, so
Well, yeah, I'm biting my tongue. I will also say Head Full of Ghosts. I would like to second that, and that plays in really well. I'm surprised we didn't get to it when we were talking about it, but the idea too of what can happen when a family starts to veer off from the quote unquote normal, and you see a different way of thinking start to shape the family. And I don't want to say too much about that because it is still relatively new if people want to go out and read the book. But there's some really interesting kind of ideologies that enter in, that are shaping things in a really neat way. Um, and so it builds upon that kind of isolation and what that can do to a budding young mind, um, in a neat way. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
I
Mel, what do you got for us? Oh,
well,
sorry.
I had one other, and I don't know how well this fits, but I'd call it an honorable mention because I don't know that the main character fits as creepy children so much as this is a creepy children's movie. But Return to Oz, which I know we've thrown
Yes.
about. But again, I don't think Dorothy is that creepy. But I just wanted to, whenever I can, give a jab at Return to Oz and how it ruined my childhood. I like to throw that one out.
Thanks for reminding me because I think we need to at some point set some Patreon goals, that if we reach, we're totally gonna make you watch that movie again.
Well,
I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know how many subscribers we'll have to reach, or maybe new downloads. I don't know, but we're gonna make you watch that movie again.
excellent. I'd say I look forward to it, but I don't.
I mean, rollerblading monkeys or whatever those things were. Yeah.
Mel, what about you? Do you have any anything you'd like to add to these recommendations?
Yeah, I was thinking of two examples, which I have to say, Matt, your example of the "Are You My Mommy" from Doctor Who, that was so, yeah, creepy. And there's also another Doctor Who episode where the companions get turned into dolls in a creepy dollhouse. And that one, there's not necessarily creepy children there, but we were talking about dollhouses earlier. So that's kind of an interesting take on that. But I have two recommendations. One is a book I talked about, I think when we were doing alternate realities, and I think I talked about it in a Patreon episode. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about it in a main ep. And that is Every Heart a Doorway by Shauna McGuire, which came out in 2016 and is kind of like, I guess, portal fantasy. It's book one of the Wayward Children series, and there are more books in that series now that I have not been able to get to. But the premise of the book is that the idea of children going into places like Narnia is real, and what happens when they come back and they can't fit in. So there's a school that they go to that helps them to learn how to fit into the real world, or not, as the case may be. And so all the children have gone to these different worlds and experienced different powers or different things, and they're back. And there's some of them maybe slightly malevolent, we don't know, but all of them are kind of creepy because they've had these experiences and are having trouble kind of fitting in. And the other is a book that I read a couple weeks ago, and I knew we were going to be talking about creepy children. And that is Thomas Tryon's The Other, which I think I mentioned at one point. But I recommend that book. It came out, I think, in the early 70s, and it was turned into a movie. I haven't seen the movie. But it's like The Bad Seed to a certain extent, but it's boys and it's twins, which kind of takes things another turn of the screw. And there's some twists in it that I thought were pretty cool. So I don't want to talk too much about it other than that kind of description, because if people read it, I don't want to spoil it for them. But there's a kind of an older rec, I guess, and a more contemporary one. And I agree with everything that you guys said as well. There's some really good examples of scary kids. Okay, well, with those recommendations, I think that's probably a good place for us to stop this episode. So listeners, I hope that you have been enjoying our series so far on creepy children, even if we did take a slight detour into creepy children's things like dollhouses this time around. And we hope you enjoy our recommendations. Please find us on social media or use our email, nofearcast@gmail.com, and let us know your favorite creepy children, or if you have anything you want to add to our discussion of these works, movies, and books that we've talked about today. Please contact us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, through our email. We love to hear from you. Also, I think I'd mentioned a little earlier talking about something on a Patreon episode. So in the weeks between our main episodes, we have mini episodes that if you join our Patreon supporters and pay $5 a month, you get that extra content. So you get to hear from us every single week instead of just every other week. So that is also something to consider. We hope you're enjoying the podcast. Please tell a friend. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts so other folks can find us. And as always, thank you for listening.